Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Somehow We Manage. We've got some more WRAL flavor for you today as we welcome on Mr. Scott Mason, better known as the Tar Heel Traveler. Much like Greg Fishel last week, if you live in the state of North Carolina, you know and love Scott Mason for all the work that he has done as the Tar Heel Traveler and all the wonderful stories he's been able to tell. So don't go anywhere, folks. You are not going to want to miss this week's edition of Somehow We Manage. Joining us now on Somehow We Manage is the Tar Heel Traveler himself, Mr. Scott Mason. Mr. Mason, it's a pleasure to be talking to you today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So obviously all of us here in the state of North Carolina know who you are. We enjoy, your work with the Tar Heel Traveler. My first question for you, though, is I'm curious how things got started. What was your inspiration to start the Tar Heel Traveler?
Yeah, I've been in television almost 40 years, and I've covered a lot of murders and fires and car wrecks. I've done sort of long form television, but I've always been drawn to the sort of the human interest story, the people stories. And I actually started with WRAL as a documentary producer. I did a number of documentaries, but then the station canceled the documentary unit. So I got thrown back into news covering murders and fires and car wrecks all over again. But then in 2007, the TV station WRAL decided to actually bring back the Tar Heel Traveler. The Tar Heel Traveler actually aired, I think, in the 70s. It wasn't as a regular thing, but they went through a variety of different hosts, and then it eventually just kind of faded away. Well, somebody at the TV station, one of the higher ups, remembered the Tar Heel Traveler and wanted to bring it back. And I think the station always kind of knew I liked those kind of stories, and so fortunately, they selected me in 2007. And so since then, a photographer and I have been roaming around doing all these colorful stories.
So when you watch these segments, you have a very unique style. You have a very specific way of speaking. How do you think you developed that sort of journalistic style?
Well, I actually had a lot of influences. Several books influenced me. When I was a kid, probably 10 or 12 years old, I always had loved to write. I just was sort of born with it. I don't know where I got that from. My parents aren't writers, but I would come home from school and write short stories and poems, and I'd throw tennis balls against the garage door and pretend I was the play-by-play man, and sort of always knew I wanted to go into broadcasting and love to write. And my dad sort of recognized that in me. And when I was 10 or 12 years old, he gave me this book that had a profound influence on me. It was actually a book of poems by a poet named Robert Service, who wrote all these rollicking ballads, Dangerous Dan McGrew and The Cremation of Sam McGee. And they were sort of stories in poem form, but they often had a twist. And I think that sense of rhythm in sentences I picked up even then, and I've always been sort of conscious of that. I really almost strain over every sentence and try to develop a sense of rhythm, or, there's certain techniques I use. I mean, I like alliteration or when it's called for. But today, doing the Tar Heel Traveler, I still kind of strain over every sentence. You think after being in TV for 40 years, that it would come easy to me, but it isn't. Every single story is a challenge, and it's kind of painstaking to weave the stories together, figure out how you're going to begin, how you're going to end, what goes in the middle, what the interview subject says, what I say, and weave all that together. So, yes, every story I'm working on for hours and hours and trying to get every sentence just right.
Can you walk me through the process for creating a story from, the time you get an idea to when it airs on WRL?
Yeah, people ask me all the time, well, how do you get your story ideas? Well, people email me all the time. It's not unusual for me to receive 2, 3, 4, 5 emails in a day from people suggesting story ideas. And day after day, week after week, month after month, all those emails add up. I I mean, I know I have at least 5,000 story ideas I haven't gotten to yet.
Wow.
And maybe 10,000 actually. Um, and I'm very careful. I print out the emails and I highlight them and title them at the top of the page and then stick them in all these folders that I have. For example, I have a Greenville folder, and people send me ideas. I put them in the Greenville folder. Next time we're headed east, well, we may be stopping through Greenville, and I'll pull out my file and see what we have in there. So with all those story ideas, I do have to sort of pick and choose. Um, and once I sort of have, say we are heading east, or in your way, toward Greenville, I might pick one out of Tarboro and stop there first, and then get to Greenville. Maybe we'll hit Kinston while we're there. So I try to shoot. Of course, when we're shooting, I try to shoot as many stories as I can that day to put in the stockpile. Now they may not air for a week or for
Right.
6 weeks, but you always want to keep a stockpile of stories. And of course, I have to do some research, not a great deal, but of course I do have to do a little bit of research, and then I call the people, set up the stories, and it's almost like dominoes. You'll shoot one at 10, and then one at 1, and then one at 3:30, and that kind of thing. It's sort of an intricate process, actually, and I'm doing it all by myself. No secretary. It's just a two-man team, myself and the photographer.
That's awesome. So what are some of the biggest challenges that come along with, bringing these stories to life?
Well, of course, lining them up when you want them to line up, that's logistically a challenge. Um, Different stories have different challenges where you go in thinking the story is about one and you find out, well, it's really about, or you may have two different elements in a story, and how do you bring those together? A good example, a story we just shot just a few days ago in Sanford. Pretty interesting story about this woman. The way I found out this story is this woman in Sanford inherited 2 billion buttons from her dad, who was a collector. He was sort of eccentric. He collected a bunch of things, and he had 2 billion buttons, like shirt buttons, but they were buttons from all over the world. And
Mm.
he, back years ago, he bought this warehouse in Sanford to store all his buttons. He had other interests in business, but the warehouse primarily was used for these buttons. Well, then the man passed away, and his daughter inherited all these buttons. Well, what is she going to do? Well, she had this warehouse. Well, she is a pretty well renowned dog trainer. So she turned the warehouse into this major dog training center. And people come from far away to train their dogs through her at this training center. Okay, so you've got these two stories, this dog training expert who has still some of the 2 billion buttons all in the warehouse. So how am I going to put those two elements together? As I was shooting the story, I'm sort of thinking, well, how am I going to do this? But that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, and that's the thing. I try to pick stories with layers that have, it's not just about this thing, but it's maybe about the person involved who also has a backstory.
Right.
I always say stories with layers are the best kind.
So I've heard you say several times that Marty, which I think was your first story, right? That's long been one of your favorites. So, and we can definitely talk about Marty, but along with him, what have been some of the most colorful characters that you've come across with the Tar Heel Traveler?
Yeah, I had a lot of great characters right from the outset of the Tar Heel Traveler. Shortly after the story on Marty, the woman from Moore County, Southern Pines, who made snake oil. Her name
Hmm.
was Wilma
Right.
Cunningham.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, she was 101 years old and still making the snake oil. And she was just so funny and energetic, and she's stirring the pots of snake oil. snake oil supposedly can cure any
Oh yeah.
ailment, and it was a recipe that she'd gotten from her dad, and she found in an old family Bible. It was tucked in the Bible, and she found this recipe for snake oil, and then began making it and sold it all over the place. So she was a great character. Um, Gosh, so many. I mean, there was the man from Chatham County who made uh, airplanes in his backyard. And I heard that story and I thought, well, like little miniature airplanes? No, these are major full size airplanes. Well, I thought, well, that can't be. Of course, when I got there, he said, oh, yeah, the control panel's made out of pork and bean cans, and the landing gear is made out of a pizza pan. And he was fantastic. Great fella. Yeah, again, another of my sayings: if you have a great character, it makes the story so much
Most
easier.
definitely.
Great characters make great stories.
So, for me and for many people that I know that watch, the best part of the Tar Heel Traveler is the food. I mean, those are the ones that get me so excited. And so, what have been some of the most memorable restaurants that you can remember going to?
Yeah, I hate to pick and choose because there are so
Oh
many.
yeah.
I released a book not too long ago, Tar Heel Traveler's Good Eats,
Mm-hmm.
101 Down Home North Carolina Classics. So I've done, actually, that was 101 restaurants that we profiled. I've done probably 201. The barbecue is always good. I think actually, one of my favorites is a place in Nags Head, Sam and Omi's, and they serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the place, being at the beach, it's just got this energy, and there's so many waitresses, and they have a bar there, and it's just colorful, and the food is good. I'm a huge breakfast eater. And then right up the road is a good little spot in Kill Devil Hill, Captain Frank's, just all kinds of hot dogs. People love the Chicago dog. But a guy named Harvey Hess and his son run Captain Frank's. And it's just the atmosphere is, you just sort of feel like you're a million miles away. And it's all the colorful T-shirts that are hanging and the ceiling fans spinning. But gosh, just so many. And I will say that I do eat well on this job.
Well, and that I was curious about that as well. That was going to be my follow up. I was always thinking, is he actually eating in these places and getting, like a taste for what he's talking about? So that's comforting to know that you're actually eating in those places.
Yeah, I'm like I say, I'm a huge breakfast eater. I eat breakfast every morning, but I actually really don't eat a lot during the day because I feel like it slows me down, which is a
Mhm.
challenge. You're at a big barbecue
Yeah.
place. Well, they want to give you barbecue
Oh
for
yeah.
lunch. And of course, feel obligated to sample something from whatever restaurant I'm at. But and I will say I've had some very good meals along the road. And I've also felt like I've needed to take a nap usually after eating them.
Right. Well, it's good Southern. I mean, a lot of it's like, fried and whatnot. You talked about your books, right? But I want to talk about Faith in Air, because you've said before that your career is based mostly on facts, right? But this is a book that's based on faith. So how did you come about writing this book?
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. As I was doing Tar Heel Traveler stories, every once in a while, somebody would just sort of off the cuff tell me about some miracle story that happened to them. I mean, a great example is we were in Pinehurst interviewing this longtime broadcaster, actually. His name was John Durr, and he had covered the Masters golf tournament longer than anyone in history. And he'd played golf with presidents. He'd met Albert Einstein. He'd even met Henry Ford. John was in his early 90s when I interviewed him. And he just entertained us with colorful stories just about golfing. Well, we were done with the interview 2 hours later, and we're taking down the lights, packing up the gear, and I was just chit chatting with him. And he said, "Oh, and by the way, there's that time I died and came back to life." And I was like, "What?" And then he proceeds to tell me off camera this whole story about him dying and coming back. And of course, it had nothing to do with the reason we were there that day, but I sort of put it in the back of my head. And then many months later, I met a woman singing and dancing on her front porch, feeding the homeless. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I was in a car wreck 10 years ago, paralyzed from the neck down, was told I would never walk again." And so I kept finding these miracle stories. And I kind of was like, somebody should be writing this down, recording these miracle stories. I just felt like it was important. It was almost like I was being led to write the book. And I finally did sit down and wrote the book. And I knew it would be challenging. It required actually quite a bit of research. It required me to go back and re-interview them at length about their miracle stories. And I really wanted to drill into the details of exactly what happened, what day it was, what they were wearing, what they were thinking, what they saw, what John Durr saw on the other side. And he said, I had one conversation and then I went to it with another conversation. He was talking to his father and then to his father-in-law. And I said, well, how did you get from one to the other? Well, I don't know. I was under a tree at one point and then I was on the porch at another. And I don't know, just different things like that. I thought it was fascinating. And the book has really done exceptionally well. It's ended up being one of the top on Amazon's nonfiction list, and I actually just recorded the audiobook for it, for the blind, but it's going to the Library of Congress, and that was so much fun recording the audiobook and doing all the different voices. And I think that's my future career. My next career is to be an audiobook narrator.
Well, congratulations on that. And another thing I could give you congratulations on is I saw where you recently hiked the Appalachian Trail. What was that experience like?
Yeah, my college buddy and I had talked about doing it for years. I just really wanted to do a section of the trail. I never really camped as a kid. I guess I was more of a city boy. Just had always and we left in September and we started in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, and only hiked like 5 days. But we hiked all through Maryland and ended up on the Pennsylvania line. Now, that section of Maryland happens to be just about the rockiest of the whole Appalachian Trail. And one of those days, we got caught in a driving day-long rain. And here we are hiking the rockiest part of that rocky whole section of Maryland. But it was a great adventure. I'm glad I did it. And actually, I recorded us hiking with my phone and interviewed my buddy, and I interviewed a few people we met along the trail, and I came back and put together a TV story, a Tar Heel Traveler story, just with video I'd shot on my phone. It was a lot of fun, actually. It even made the hike more fulfilling by shooting a story while I was doing it.
So, what do you think have been some of the greatest lessons that you've learned since taking on this project?
Well, I think you always have to be a good listener. Uh, I tell my wife, whenever we go to say a party or something, and we'll be there for 3 or 4 hours, and we'll leave, and I say, nobody asked me a single question. It's kind of strange. I don't think people, for some reason these days, ask questions. They don't seem interested. I am, gosh, because I feel like when you talk to people, you often find commonalities, things that they've done that, oh, I've done that too, and I've always been interested in people's backgrounds, and my parents were as well. They asked a lot of questions. I think I got that from them. So I think that's probably the primary thing, and with the stories, I feel like it's not just a piddly little segment that's on the news 4 nights a week. I do feel like there's more depth to it than that. I tell you, I can't tell you how many people who I've interviewed who have since passed away. And yet I feel like I've somehow preserved their story. And I speak often to groups all over the state and beyond. And when I speak, I show excerpts of TV stories I've done. And I'm often showing these excerpts of people who've passed away. And so I kind of feel like their story lives on, which is I just feel very privileged and grateful to be able to do that.
So what can fans of the show expect to see in the future from the Tar Heel Traveler? How much longer do you think you'll keep this going?
I don't know. That's a good question. There are other things I would like to do. For example, audiobooks. I'd like to narrate some commercials, and I'd like to still continue to write. I've written this novel that I am desperately trying to find a literary agent who will represent it and then peddle it to publishers. And I feel like the novel is pretty good. It was, my first work of fiction. It's about a young TV reporter finding his way, kind of a endearing coming of age story. And I feel like I actually could write a sequel to the novel. But the first step is trying to get that one published. And then I'm actually writing another Tar Heel Traveler book. I've written 5 Tar Heel Traveler books. This would be my 6th, and it's just about places across North Carolina, sort of unique and unusual places. I just finished the chapter on the granite quarry in Mount Airy, the largest open-face granite quarry in the world, and astronauts can actually see it from space. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting places like that. And so this book will just be devoted to places. So I do feel like there's more writing in my future, I hope.
Well, and that was going to be my follow-up was can we expect to see more books from Scott Mason as well? But like you said, you're kind of a born writer, so I would assume that's not going to stop anytime soon.
Yep, I still enjoy writing. It's not easy. And there's a lesson. The lesson in that is really to be consistent and to write every day if you can. And I really do. I spend my mornings writing generally. Fortunately, with the Tar Heel Traveler, I can make my own hours to some extent. So I try to write, and then I go in and do all my Tar Heel Traveler. Of course, I mean staying up until 1 o'clock in the morning, but that's okay.
So as I close here, we're at the time of this recording, we're here in the summertime, so we're not far from the fall, which means the state fair, right? So I want to ask you, can you give me your top 3 state fair foods?
Oh, state fair foods. Well, I can probably only give you one
Okay.
top state fair food, and that is the biscuits. I love going
Oh
to
yeah, the biscuits are the best.
the whole line of they're usually churches, and
Yes.
they're a fundraiser to raise
Yep.
money for their churches. There's a whole row of them, and I've become very good friends with the people who run those places, and I always get a biscuit or an egg biscuit or a ham biscuit. Honey Cuts is one of them. One of the places, the longtime family, and then the Apex Lions Club, and there's the Cary Church, and I've kind of done stories on all of them, so I've gotten to know those hard-working folks who put their love into every biscuit.
Well, we'll close on that, and on behalf of all of us who grew up here in rural North Carolina, I just want to say thank you because what you've been able to do through this is give people like me who grew up in these rural areas a chance to share their stories, and that's a big deal to us. So thank you for that. I mean, you've done amazing work, and I know you'll continue to do great things, even if it's not on television with books or whatever the case may be. So thank you for coming on today. Thank you for the work you've done. We appreciate it. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you, Caegan. It's a great job. Might be the best job in all of television, and North Carolina is just a fantastic state to explore.
It is. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on today. We wish you the very best of luck moving forward.
Thank you, Caegan.
Thank you so much for watching us today on Somehow We Manage. A big thank you to Mr. Scott Mason, the Tar Heel Traveler, for coming on today and joining us. So many great stories to tell, and we know he's going to continue to tell great stories with his work through WRAL. And an even bigger thank you to those of you who join us every week and watch and support us. And as always, we're on all social media outlets. We're on YouTube. We're on Spotify. And we're so appreciative for those of us who watch. And also a huge shout out to Mr. JR Equipment, Mr. Mel Equipment, for producing our podcast and bringing this thing to life for you. So thank you again. This has been Caegan Jackson signing off now at Somehow We Manage.